Wait, hold on. Sanji prepared the crew's favorites, right? But I don't see any cotton candy here, Mr. Vince Smoke Sanji. Yeah, you know what? On second thought, who the f cares? Let's just leave him here. Let's pack up. Bye-bye, Sanji. Have a happy marriage. Hello, my fellow wannabe Straw Hats, and welcome back to the One Piece saga, where today we have an arc that can only be described as an absolutely beautiful tragedy. I'll say it right now, you all know how I feel about Sanji, so my expectations for this were set incredibly high on that basis alone, because there seriously isn't a lot that could redeem him for me at this point. So, let's see how all of that turned out in Whole Cake Island. Before I get into the downright depressing story of this arc, let's start with something light and fun. The starving crew and all the shenanigans that came out of that. The whole Luffy eating a poisonous fish and then supposedly dying, which prompts Chopper to cry, yet still constantly interrupt himself to say yum, was some grade A comedy. And then of course there's the cotton candy rain, which also made Lil Chopper a very joyous boy. And yeah, this was just some good old Straw Hat banter. And I'm sorry for jumping around already, but I also want to mention right away how much I enjoyed the cyclical nature of this arc. Obviously, much of the story we'll be dealing with is getting our cook back, so very fittingly, we open the arc with the crew all starving. But the very final shots of the arc would be Sanji cooking for them. Just a small detail that I thought was a really nice touch to put a bow on basically everything we see here. We also get some Germa lore right away, where, most importantly, we learn that it is a kingdom with no land and is essentially just a moving fortress. We'll talk about the settings plenty more later, but I think the entire premise of Germa and their military was super unique, and I'd honestly want to see some sort of flashback as to how they conquered the North Blue way back when. And most of all, I want to see how they play into the wider power balance of the world. Clearly they have some ridiculously advanced tech. So I'm guessing people like Dofi might have shown interest in something like that, among other big shots. So TLDR, I may hate their guts, but I do want to hear more Germa lore. As for our big bads, almost straight away we learned that Big Mom's goal was always to create a land with no discrimination of any sort, which, on the face of it, obviously seems like a very pure goal. But of course, almost immediately we find out, as with most things, it is in fact too good to be true, and is more akin to a deal with the devil, as living in her territory involves paying with your lifespan. I am an absolute sucker for the deal with the devil trope as is, so I was super intrigued by that alone, though unfortunately, I don't really think it was properly followed up, which was a bit unfortunate. In terms of offsetting the whole paradise-like nature of our territory, it does its job, but I wish the whole concept would have been explored a tad more, because I imagine trading away your life is a pretty big deal. Even if we got a conversation with just some rando who tries justifying how and why they live or something like that, I think it could have been pretty interesting. Though one thing that I absolutely adored was the setting of this arc. The whole each island is a different kind of food thing was just super cool and seriously gave me those classic fantasy vibes of islands being made of all kinds of food and whatnot. Literally, the moment I saw Whole Cake Island, I just heard Captain Knuckles in my head talking about Candied Island. So I also got a bit of a wave of nostalgia from that too. And of course, this is another case of the entire landscape being totally terraformed by fruit users, which I think supports my Grand Line origin theory I raised back in Punk Hazard. The only problem I had with this, and I know this is very much me nitpicking, I couldn't help but think that Big Mom has too many food-related fruits. Obviously the theming is excellent, right? But a good 90% of her children have exclusively food-related fruits, which first off, seems a bit hard to believe considering how rare the fruits are and how many of them don't have their effects known, and two, honestly got a bit old. Oda obviously leaned into the theme big time, and I think it worked, but I would have loved to see just a little bit more variety on that front. That said, the islands themselves are excellent, and can I please move to a coffee and chocolate island? Thank you very much. Or better yet, a coffee and a honey cake island. Oh yes, please. Another major character we meet almost straight away is Pudding, who too caught me by surprise in basically every sense of the word. But with that said, can I just say that she turned out to have one of my favorite narrative arcs in the entire story so far? From her introduction to her turning on the Straw Hats, to her overcoming all of that was a super bittersweet tale that I think perfectly accompanied the bigger story we were seeing. Oh, and just like with Momo, I saw none of this coming. So the sheer shock value of the reveal alone already had my eyeballs protruding. The entire sequence of Sanji after he had finally accepted his fate, just standing outside of the window with that bouquet of flowers in the rain was oof. And then even his cigarette going out. Get ready to hear this a lot, but it was just downright brutal. That said, smoking literally makes you smell like death, and I guarantee you everybody around you hates it. And the next time you stand next to me on the bus, please don't smoke 3 seconds before you get on. I am literally suffocating here, please send help. So as sad as Sanji may be, it is good that it went out. Oh, and then the reveal that Luffy was going ape, literally trying to tear his own limbs off because Pudding told him what she was up to. Oh boy. Luffy literally ripping himself apart for one of his crewmates. I mean, yeah, the symbolism here is very clear, I think. And judging by all of my law conspiracies, it's probably not surprising that I loved every second of it. And please, please, Oda, give me more backstab stories. CP9, Pudding, Law, give me more. Skipping ahead a little, we see Pedro and Brook going after the red Poneglyph. And in as few words as possible, this entire sequence beginning to end was awesome. And frankly, I think Brook's role in this entire raid is severely underappreciated. The Mad Lad literally stood solo against Big Mom and still managed to get a copy of literally a fourth of what we need to get to Raftel. We're all so worried with some easily replaceable cook, but Brook's out here single-handedly making Luffy the king of the pirates. Am I kidding about Sanji? Am I not? Who knows? Jokes aside, considering Brook wasn't a part of the Dressrosa gang, I think giving him this moment to shine was awesome. And of course, let's not overlook Pedro, who too is an absolute MVP. Frankly, there were times in this arc where I thought he might just end up becoming a Straw Hat. Because yeah, he exhibits some real Straw Hat energy in his fight against the angry egg chicken boy. Obviously, we all know how this arc ends, and I sure hope that it actually does end there. But in his fight against the very creatively named Tamago, he more than earned a spot amongst the crew in my book. Considering he never got to sail with Roger, I thought he would end up sailing with the next Pirate King, but alas. Oh, and yeah, the angry chicken egg boy man constantly transforming into another phase was the most downright stupid thing I've ever seen, and I loved every second of it. Returning to Luffy's gang though, we see them enter the Twisting Forest, which, unfortunately, I think was a major low point of this arc. The swamp in Avatar is one of my favorite episodes, so I thought maybe we'd get some of that vibe here where no matter what you do, you get lost. But the bulk of it just turned out to be the Cracker fight, which was almost comically fillery feeling. Luffy literally smashing all of them down, only for them to reappear time after time, seriously got old very, very quick. Of course, as per usual, I don't know how much of this is just an anime thing, but for what was just a minor antagonist, the fight was just way, way, way too long. And with that said, let us get to the man himself. And alright, all jokes aside, Sanji's narrative in this arc was nothing short of excellent. And I'll ruin the surprise for you right now. While for me, it does not make up for all the things I've criticized him for before, in this arc, it was genuinely excellent. For the sake of time, I obviously won't be able to get into all of it because there is seriously a lot, but let's go down the list. We start off with him throwing down with his father almost right away, where we are also immediately shown the complete split in how they view the world. Obviously, the fight itself is super emotionally charged, but the moment Judge started to use the Germa soldiers as just human shields, it was pretty clear that Sanji and him are basically water and oil. Oh, and also, not sure whether this was intentional or not, but I also found the fact that Sanji is swatted around by Judge using his legs as some pretty tragic parallels considering that's exactly how he met Zeph. We also, of course, find out the reason behind his name, which, by the way, is another clever case of Oda playing with names. Because we have characters like Tamago who are very much an egg, I never really gave Sanji's name much thought. Yeah, his name is 3, why not, right? But here, that is completely recontextualized, as we basically learn that with them being lab-grown soldiers, the whole human aspect of having a name is never even a consideration. And so, they are all simply numbers. A small detail, sure, but one that very neatly embodies Judge's views toward his children and the world in general. And then we have the dinner scene where, because we are operating in a family drama story, you obviously know things are going to go very, very wrong. And the only thing I want to note here is that I fully expected and actually wanted to see Sanji force Niji to eat the food off the ground. That of course didn't happen, but regardless, the tension in that entire sequence was seriously thick enough to be cut with a knife as is. So maybe adding even more fuel to the fire this early on would have just been a tad too much. Especially because Sanji was trying to keep it on the down low as is. And then we have the whole backstory of Sanji's mom, how he started to cook for her and how she demanded to try Sanji's food despite it being terrible. Oh, Oda was pulling each and every one of my heartstrings. I think everyone who's ever cooked something for their moms knows this entire spiel of them loving anything you make. And because I myself love cooking, this hit particularly hard. And then that butterfly landing on Sanji's finger and him getting shaken by it because he remembers his mom. Oh, Oda, why? And on top of all of that, we have Sanji getting locked up with that downright medieval looking helmet, which I think might be the darkest thing we've ever seen in the series, which is saying a lot considering the themes we have already seen. But the entire dichotomy of Judge rejecting Sanji as his son and him escaping, I mean, this little dude has been through more than some have been in their entire life. And keep in mind, all of this is not even taking into account the horrible events we saw when he got stranded with Zeph. And speaking of Zeph, it's also here where we learn where Sanji's chivalry comes from, as Zeph explained that he could never hire a woman because he teaches his cooks through kicking them. Which is like, okay, let's get the safety inspector here. But jokes aside, it's just another point where we see that Sanji's one and only father really is Zeph. And above all of that, the dissonant theme that played every time Sanji was on screen was just pure excellence. So yeah, between Nami, Robin, and Sanji, oh boy, the Straw Hats have some emotional baggage. But it's then that we get to what is hands down, no questions asked, and 300% the best part of this arc. The Luffy versus Sanji sequence. Oh man, I had my reaction recorded for this, but what is there even to say? There is so much to say, but also nothing at all. The entire moment was just the definition of sorrow. The easy comparison here is of course the Luffy versus Usopp fight, but let's be real. The stakes there weren't nearly as high as they were here. I love God Usopp, but Sanji is one of the Straw Hats' main fighters. And as far as I can tell, he wasn't exactly holding back here that much either. Yet Luffy just turns off his hockey and just tanks each and every hit. And then that scene. Oh man, that scene as his tooth falls out and he finally loses consciousness. And the conversation between them during all of this is just the salt in the wound. I do think Luffy permanently losing his tooth would have, again, been a perfect example of how these sorts of things have consequences, and Luffy would forever wear that on literally his face. But him getting it back later by drinking milk did seriously give me the giggles, so I can forgive that. Though another thing I have to mention in this entire thing is Nami, because man, her just standing there literally broke my heart. Her just being forced to watch on as her captain, and don't forget her literal savior is beaten down by one of their own, and then her just shaking Luffy as he lies in a pool of his own bloods, that is seriously as brutal as it gets. And as if all of that wasn't enough, she then walks up to Sanji, gives him a solid slap, and simply says, "We shouldn't have come here. Goodbye." For the tiniest sliver of a second, I thought Sanji might hit her back. But of course, thankfully, he does not, and the fight is seemingly over. Only, it is not, because we then see Luffy get up and call out to Sanji. If I had to rank individual scenes, what follows is likely my favorite one in the entire series. Because we constantly jump between Luffy, who claims that he will stand there and wait for him, saying that without him, he can't be the king of the pirates, and finally saying, if you don't come here, I'll stand here, starving to death. And all of this is cut together as Sanji just slowly descends into a full-on breakdown. This is peak One Piece. I think you know by this point that I adore tragedy in stories. There's a reason why Sabaody is still one of my favorite arcs after all. But this was just on a whole nother level. Just how quickly all the bigger story falls away and all I cared about was this crew. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, this is hands down the greatest written sequence in the story. And I don't know if this is just me or not, but the duo of Luffy and Nami just make this entire thing that much worse for me. This may totally be my own headcanon, but with them being one of the first members of the crew, their bond has always seemed stronger than with most other members of the crew. Obviously, we've seen that all of them would give their lives for each other, etc. But there's something about these two that just feels different. Maybe it's because Nami is literally the guide for Luffy's life and Luffy is the one who freed her, or maybe it's the stark contrast in their personalities, but regardless of the reason, I seriously enjoyed their dynamic throughout this arc. And the whole Nami just trying to hold Luffy back but obviously dealing with losing Sanji herself, all of this was just brutal. And in a broader sense, I love how the usually goofy aspect of Luffy's hunger is suddenly turned on its head to be a 100% serious proclamation. Because even on a jokey front, Luffy giving up food for someone is a huge deal, right? And here he stands saying that he will stand there starving to death. And oh boy, the weather. This is always a cheeky thing to pull, but I love that during their duel, the stormy clouds set in and a literal storm begins. Again, the symbolism here is very much on the nose, but I seriously enjoy whenever shows use these sorts of weather shifts to further convey the tone of the story. But catching up with Sanji, it's here where we get a scene that literally made me write in my notes just a single word. They have a whole conversation with Pudding about the wedding and whatnot, but the only line that mattered to me was the "my adventure ends here." Because sheesh, in the context of One Piece, that's as bad as it gets. Literally everything so far has been just that, an adventure. So Sanji wholeheartedly accepting that this is indeed where his story ends was just downright tragic. Though luckily, there's one good thing to come out of all this, and that is the relationship Sanji has with his sister. Let's be real, even with everything that would transpire later in the arc, she is the only decent human being in the whole Germa household. So her constantly looking after her little bro, knowing full well that no one would be looking out for her, was just super wholesome. And alright, I know said Luffy vs Sanji was the best sequence of the arc, but there's one more, and that is the entire Bento Box sequence. First off, the entire scene of Luffy just stumbling around like a zombie trying to get back to their meeting spot was simply excellent. And then that scene of Sanji finally smiling as he sees the shriveled up Luffy. Oh man, and then the epic version of We Are kicking in the background. I'll be honest, at this point in the arc, I was just writing in my notes, easy S tier. But of course, it doesn't end there just yet, because even after meeting Luffy, Sanji explains that Zeph is in trouble and that he isn't rejoining the crew. And it's then that Luffy once again pulls his big move. He bonks him over the head and finally says, "Say what you really want." And after all of that, Sanji breaks and finally says he wants to go back to the Sunny. And just like that, the clouds part and a glimmer of sunshine shines through. Yeah, I said it already, but as far as character arcs go, Sanji's story in Whole Cake Island is some of Oda's best writing, and I'll fight anyone who says otherwise. Okay, maybe I won't really fight, but you get what I mean. Wait, hold on. Sanji prepared the crew's favorites, right? But I don't see any cotton candy here, Mr. Vinsmoke Sanji. Yeah, you know what? On second thought, who the f cares? Let's just leave him here. Let's pack up. Bye-bye, Sanji. Have a happy marriage. Jokes aside, almost immediately we also get to see a reunion between him and Nami. And the whole him being ashamed of even seeing her, only for her to joyfully ask him if he's okay, was just, again, super wholesome. And it's following this point that I couldn't help but notice a tonal shift in Sanji's character that I can only liken to Robin. From this point on, I feel like the only word I can use for this is catharsis. Everything about him just feels more lighthearted, even more so than earlier in the story. Just like with Robin, he has seemingly found peace and is putting 100% of his trust in Luffy. Obviously, he always followed him before, but when Luffy did something reckless, he always had that, oh, here we go again attitude. Whereas from this point on, he genuinely felt like he's just loving every moment he's here. He didn't even care what trouble Luffy got into anymore, he was just happy to be by his side. Not sure whether that's just my own headcanon or not, but that's seriously how it felt like. And alright, I know I've said it like 50 times already, but we then enter yet another incredible part of this arc, and that is the very unlikely alliance between the Straw Hats and Capone. I'll say it right now, the entire over-the-top Mafia family meeting was legit a 10 out of 10. Seeing Chopper have a Lil Dapper suit and Crime Boss Luffy in a suit was just excellent. And I also think that it worked as a really nice change of pace tonally as, let's be honest, compared to the downright depressing story we saw with Sanji, this was pretty comedy heavy. And in a broader sense, the entire Capone story was also super interesting as, what feels like for the first time in the story, we were actually working with a well thought out plan. Obviously, it would still go haywire, but the entire planning sequence was seriously top-tier old-timey mafia heist vibes. TLDR, can we bring Capone along for our inevitable fight against Kaido because he is seriously cool and I want to see more of him. And another thing to remember is Jimbei's promise from Fishman Island, and here we get to just that, because we finally see him go to Big Mom and announce himself joining Luffy's crew. And the entire sequence of her being powerless because he is not afraid of her, and then saying, of course he can't be afraid of a mere emperor if he used to sail with the king of the pirates. Literal perfection. And unlike Fishman Island, where I wasn't exactly sure what his role on the crew would even be, as we'd see later in this arc, it's pretty clear that our boy Jimbei is a surfing king. So yes, I very much want to see him on the crew. But with all that, we enter the climax of the arc, the wedding. I'll once again hold off all of my red wedding jokes out of fear of spoiling someone, but this felt like a much goofier and a wackier version of that. First off, the entire Sanji pudding dynamic in this one was awesome, and the fact that Sanji is the first ever person to call Pudding's third eye beautiful was also high-key sad. And as much as I wanted Pudding to actually be a baddie through and through, as I said at the top of the video, it still turned out to be one of my favorite arcs exactly because it demonstrates that entire evolution of growing up in a toxic environment and being corrupted yourself to finally finding freedom, because there is someone who accepts you for who you truly are. It's just a very nice B-plot that worked very well with everything else going on. And then of course, once all hell breaks loose and all 50 Luffys burst out of the cake, we also get the incredible scene of Sanji going to save his family. And when he's asked why he even did that, he simply answers, "My father would be sad," obviously referring to Zeph. So yes, I do admit, another big dub for our boy Curly Brow. And in the midst of all of this craziness, as the picture of Mother is broken, we drift into a Big Mom flashback. And I'll say it right now, I don't know whether this is a controversial take or not, but I literally despised Big Mom by the end of this arc for a long list of reasons. First off, we've had plenty of wacky characters before, but with Big Mom, I genuinely have a hard time believing how she even came to power. Literally the weakest link in the Big Mom Pirates is Big Mom. You might remember that back in Little Garden, I said I loved the giants in One Piece because they were actually intelligent, unlike some other mythologies where they are often portrayed as big lumbering oofs. Well, yeah, Big Mom is exactly what I meant by that. And her flashback really just cemented that feeling for me. Because like, was I supposed to feel bad for her? I don't know if I'm a monster or not, but I really didn't. Yeah, obviously her being left behind by her parents is high-key brutal and all, but like, by the end of the flashback, we'd explicitly see that she is a danger to everyone around her. I suppose much of it is out of her control, but regardless, I feel much more bad for anyone around her, even if her story is quite tragic. And speaking of which, at the end of the flashback, all of her buddies disappear. And, I may totally be off base here, but, is it implied that she ate them? Because, what? And then there's the entire question of her getting Mother's fruit power, which also just has me scratching my head because, like, how did that happen? Did she legit eat her and that's how she got her fruit power? But how does the whole Blackbeard situation play into this then? Obviously, there we have two mysteries. How he can have two fruits and how he stole Whitebeard's fruits. But like, I am 500% certain he didn't eat him, that's for sure. Or did he? Remember my whole soul thing that I couldn't stop talking about in Marineford? Yeah, what if Big Mom ate Mother and by extension, obviously also her soul? But Blackbeard simply used his power to draw out Whitebeard's soul. Kinda makes sense if you ask me, especially because we now have yet another fruit power that works with souls and their energy specifically. But with all that said, I really don't like Big Mom neither in the flashback or in the present. I think she's a bumbling fool who I have a hard time believing even became an emperor, and that's basically all I have to say about it. Except it isn't, because as we cut to the present, we enter what I unfortunately think is another serious low point of this arc. The long, never-ending chase. Of course, the whole rigged box with explosives we saw back in Fishman Island takes out the part of the structure and basically everything goes wrong. And I'll say it right now, if I ever hear the words wedding ukeku or mama ever again in my entire life, Luffy and Capone will have another ally in getting rid of her. No joke, even Foxy wasn't as downright obnoxious as Big Mom by the end of this arc. And because the chase we'll be talking about in a second felt literally never-ending, it certainly didn't make it feel any better. And speaking of the chase, despite the Lodge Mother being a complete buffoon, her power is still obviously off the charts, and so escaping her isn't that easy. And that is when Pedro realizes that this is what his dream really was. He may not have sailed with Roger, but he has sailed with the King of the Pirates. And he now has to make sure that the King of the Pirates can get out safe. And so, he sacrifices himself to ensure the Straw Hats escape. And oh boy, if this is another Pell situation, I swear you will never hear the end of it. Because the moment he shares with Carrot right before he tells her to run was the most bittersweet thing ever. All the shots of young Pedro talking to Roger, and then us cutting to Carrot as she just sees the fireball engulf the shore. Oh boy, I guess we really are entering the endgame, and this is what a game against the Emperors looks like. And before you ask, yes, I very much enjoyed those 20 seconds of seeing Roger almost as much as those 2 seconds of seeing Dragon, and almost as much as seeing Shanks in Marineford for a grand total of 2 minutes. Jokes aside, despite Pedro's sacrifice, it still isn't enough to let them fully escape. And it's then that we get to what might just be the best Luffy fight so far. First off, the scene of Luffy hopping into the Mirror Realm and smashing his way out to protect his crew was absolutely excellent. But that said, that is also a reason why I heavily dislike it. It felt so extremely detached from everything else going on that it almost felt like an artificial DPS check for Luffy more than anything else. He's basically pulled into the Mirror Realm where he can't help anyone, he can't be helped by anyone, so he just fights a single dude for who knows how long. Throughout much of it, the entire premise of Big Mom honestly just felt removed outright. That said, despite it feeling quite artificial, I absolutely loved the fight, mostly because it seriously gave me JoJo vibes. Just the constant escalation of the fight and the fact that their powers were extremely similar had me glued to my screen the entire way through. And that was only further strengthened by the fact that Katakuri broke the ultimate anime rule. When Luffy was entering 4th gear and doing his whole transformation, Katakuri bonked him mid-transformation, and that alone deserves an award. Whenever anime gets realistic for a second just to up tension, I am all here for it. So Katakuri just going for it and not even allowing him to transform was a big W. And story-wise, is it a stretch to say that Katakuri might be among the most important fights for Luffy? Because his power is so similar, I feel like Luffy seriously learns a ton here. Not to mention the fact that he also learns to use an even more advanced form of observation haki to literally peer into the future. Which, by the way, is Charlie's future seeing just ridiculously OP observation haki? Who knows? And another thing I want to note here is just how many times Luffy gets beaten down. I mean, yeah, this is a shonen, of course he gets beat down, right? But with Katakuri, I genuinely felt like he was being challenged magnitudes more than with any other past foe. And I know this might make some of you get mad at me, but this is one of very few fights in the series that actually had stakes for me. Obviously, with all the narrative beats we'd seen so far, I was like 99.9% sure that Luffy would of course win, but something about the way this entire thing went down just seemed different from other big bads. And with all that said, Luffy not only peers into the future, but is also forced to unveil a new, I guess, sub-technique of Gear 4th? Snake Man. Which, based on my understanding, is just Gear 4th with Luffy speccing more into movement and strength rather than defense. Might be a hot take, but I think this is a much cooler look for Gear 4th, and I kinda hope is the one we see used from now on. Because Bounce Man just looks silly in my opinion. Oh yeah, and speaking of which, I haven't really mentioned it yet, but the Germa soldiers are the goofiest I've ever seen in my life. But yeah, curious to see if old Snake Boy comes with some other nifty tricks that might further separate it from what we've seen before. Oh, and also, it's super cool that we are actually getting all the flashbacks to his training. I need more. For like, everyone. Like right now. Especially Zoro. I need to see the dysfunctional family of Zoro, Ghost Girl, and Hawkeye. Like, right now. Give me a spin-off. So, TLDR, Katakuri is an incredible bad guy. I am very glad that he stepped in for Big Mom because I hate Big Mom. The Mirror Realm is silly and I wasn't a fan of it, but the fight is definitely top 5 material. What isn't top 5 material is what's going on outside of the Mirror Realm, because at this point, I was seriously starting to tune out. I mentioned this already, but while the whole cooking up an emergency cake idea was a unique way of overcoming a big bad, I couldn't help but constantly be 1. Annoyed by Big Mom, and 2. Just think that this entire thing just doesn't make any sense, which is a lot considering we are operating in the world of One Piece. In a weird way, I feel like Whole Cake Island pulled off something quite bizarre in that its middle is the strongest part, whereas with most other stories, it would always be the start and the end. For example, the arrival at Dressrosa and beating Doffy. It's usually the middle part that is dragged out. Whereas here, it is basically the opposite. The whole Cracker sub-arc got extremely stale. Get it? Stale because crackers. And the Big Mom chase was just unbearable, so yeah, Operation WEEEEEDIIIINGUUU KEIKU wasn't a favorite of mine. Though one thing that was certainly awesome was Carrot's awakening, which is a trope I absolutely love by the way. Powers that depend on weather patterns or other natural phenomena? Sign me up, I'm an Avatar fan after all. Though yeah, seeing her fueled by rage and sorrow as she just goes absolutely all out on Big Mom's ships was awesome. And while I still don't really see it, I would kind of want to see her on the crew. I am 99% sure she won't join, but having an extra fighter before we face off against Kaido would sure come in handy. Especially if it is someone who has this sort of empowered state. And while there are obviously many other insane feats we see in this one, I feel like Jimbei's mastery over the ship is one I absolutely have to bring up. Obviously, the animation in these scenes is just beautiful, but the way Jimbei has already embraced the Straw Hat energy and is just pulling Hail Mary after Hail Mary is absolutely perfect. And another thing I absolutely have to note here is the conclusion to Sanji and Pudding's story, because oh boy, is it messed up. Her being so taken aback by Sanji's genuine appreciation of her, which obviously is the first time she's felt something like that, really felt like the perfect bookend for this arc. And then that scene of her kissing him but taking his memories to keep forever, I genuinely felt bad for Pudding and she was trying to kill him like a day ago. But emotions aside, I have one question. How did Brook carry Carrot across the water? Surely she weighs more than he does, and wasn't the whole shtick of him being able to run across water because he is extremely light? Massive plot hole, 0 out of 10. Before you write that comment, that was a joke. So, I know that many of you just want to know one thing. An explicit answer to the question of, do I think Sanji is redeemed and do I like him now? And as with all good answers, it is complicated. Did this arc change my opinions on him? No, not at all. None of these events changed any of my thoughts about, for example, the infamous Absalom scene. Nor did it change my thoughts about him in Fishman Islands. Zeph taught him respect and chivalry, not being a weirdo. Is he the best written character? Well, yes and no. He is among the most written characters, but I think he could easily be also the best written character. But as I've said many times already, Sanji is perfectly fine right up until the moment where Oda decides to lean into his quote-unquote comedy side. And that is when he becomes just insufferable. Fact of the matter is, I think if you went through the series, this is where many of my criticisms come from, just overdone gags. It's the same reason why I don't like Buggy. It's just a joke that is beaten to death. The example I use all the time is Zoro getting lost. The gag is always there, but he doesn't suddenly just wander out of a battle, right? And on top of all that, we see the gag subverted in Return to Sabaody, for instance, where he is the first to return, obviously implying that things have changed, but then he still gets lost moments after. It's ultimately the same gag, but at least it's shaken up a little bit. So, is Sanji my favorite Straw Hat now? No, not by a long shot. Might that change? I mean, I doubt it, but who knows, jury's still out. Maybe he'll suddenly realize being a creep is just weird and maybe he'll move up then. But is his story in this particular arc excellent? Yes, 100% yes. Take it from the most dedicated Sanji hater. If anyone doesn't recognize the brilliance in this arc, then I don't know what they're watching, because sheesh. If I had to summarize this arc in as few words as possible, I would call it an absolutely beautiful tragedy. From friends having to fight friends to downright horrible and abusive families, it was a tragedy. But all of those hurt people, especially in the case of Sanji and Pudding, came together and made each other better. And if that isn't beautiful, then I really don't know what is. And also, yes, I now know what the "I will wait for you in the land of Wano" meme is. And yes, the scene was incredible, and Jimbei, I too will wait for you in the land of Wano. And that is the much anticipated Whole Cake Island. To be honest with you, this one is super hard to rate for me because my knee-jerk reaction is easy S tier. I think you remember my thoughts about Usopp versus Luffy from Water 7, and Sanji versus Luffy was about 3 times more intense, not to mention the rest of the drama we saw go down. That said, I do think that Whole Cake Island was ultimately a bit of a letdown when it comes to the setting, especially with the Luffy versus Katakuri fight, which felt extremely detached from everything else. But on the flip side again, it gave us the incredible scene that was Luffy smashing the mirror, and the fight itself was easily among my favorites in the entire series. But on the flip side yet again, the entire start of the arc with Cracker was, if I'm being brutally honest, one of the most boring things we've ever had in One Piece, or at least in a very long time. Ditto for the very long chase at the end, which just felt never-ending. So, with all that said, I realize this might be very controversial and maybe this is down to the anime, but for now, it will barely eke it out as a S tier arc and just barely knocking out Enies Lobby. And by barely, I really do mean barely. But hey, it's still the first proper post-time skip arc that has cracked the S tier, and I think that just speaks volumes to how strong it is, even if it surpasses all of my nostalgia-clouded judgments. But alright, I've rambled on for long enough, and with all that said, it is time to look elsewhere in the world as the reverie has begun. And that's the video. Oh boy, finally the cat's out of the bag, right? And because we're now past all of my Sanji takes, I'll be forcing myself to rank all the Straw Hats live on stream. So keep an eye out for that in the coming week or so. And also, in case you haven't heard me talk about it yet, this was originally recorded way back in July when I was binging the series during the Void month, and originally, this was 3 separate parts which I edited down to just one video just to not put you through months of waiting while I work on the edits. So hopefully you enjoyed the much snappier than usual approach to this one. As usual, One Piece discussions obviously don't end with these videos, and I ramble on a ton about previous arcs on live streams as well. All of that said, as usual, I want to give a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Manu C. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.